Hi, I'm Phil Harbottle, and this is my 35th video discussing 1950s British science fiction. In this video, we continue to take a detailed look behind the scenes of the sudden explosion of hardcover books in the early 1950s. Sidgwick and Jackson gradually emerged as one of the leading quality science fiction hardcover publishers. After having great success in 1950 with a groundbreaking non-fiction book, The Conquest of Space by Willie Ley, beautifully illustrated by Chesley Bonestell, in November 1951, they turned to science fiction with The Sands of Mars by Arthur C. Clarke, reprinting a plate of Mars by Bonestell as the cover illustration. Clarke had already won international acclaim with his trailblazing non-fiction books Interplanetary Flight 1950 and The Exploration of Space. There's The Exploration of Space, Chesley Bonestell, and there's his Interplanetary Flight, published in 1950. Was the publisher of Clarke's Sands of Mars identified the book there, as you see on the dust jacket, as a full-length science fiction novel, they didn't follow it up until September 1952, when they published his juvenile novel, Islands in the Sky. This was beautifully illustrated in scraperboard by New World's artist Gerald Quinn. Just take a look at some of the beautiful scraperboard work which Quinn did. He was the main artist of New World. Some have seen his work in earlier videos. And there's another splendid plate done on scraperboard. Now the next development from Sidgwick and Jackson was in March for Arthur C. Clarke's novel Prelude to Space, with the dust jacket by Gerald Quinn. Unfortunately, it's a bit missing on my copy, but this is the Prelude to Space. Now the back cover featured trailers for two forthcoming science fiction novels, The Man Who Sold the Moon by Robert E. Heinlein and The Demolished Man by Alfred Bester. And it also invited readers to look out for the Science Fiction Book Club, which had just formed. Now in the Science Fiction Book Club, the titles were the titles of the Science Fiction Book Club were initially priced at 6 shillings, but quickly dropped to only 4 and 6, half the price of the average trade editions. They were originally selected by a team of 4, Arthur C. Clarke, J.J. Porter, E. Shanks, and inevitably John Cornell. The books were very well made and printed from the original publisher's plates, but the only thing not to like about them was the billboard dust jackets. But the books were projected to sell because of the quality of the selections, which, as well as publishing some of the best titles issued recently in the last couple of years, included the odd classic title. The first title was George Stewart's Earth Abides, which had won the International Fantasy Award in 1951 as Best Novel. And within the next 2 years, books by Bradbury, Stapleton, Asimov, Bester, and many others were followed, such as this edition of Alien Dust by E.C. Tubb. Now, the back of the dust jacket of Sidgwick edition of The Man Who Sold the Moon carried the headline Science Fiction, and retrospectively claimed Clarke's 3 earlier novels as part of the ongoing series, announcing Best as the Demolished Man as being in preparation. When this book finally appeared in November, it was accompanied by another American reprint, Judith Merrill's Shadow on the Hearth, a moving first novel telling of the effects of a nuclear holocaust from the viewpoint of an ordinary woman. The back covers of both the dust jackets informed the readers that more and more people are reading science fiction, first-class entertaining reading, which gives you something to think about. Sidgwick and Jackson specialise in this branch of writing and have already published 3 novels of the age of space travel by the leading English writer Arthur C. Clarke, chairman of the British Interplanetary Society. After listing their titles to date, the advert concluded with a further plug for the Science Fiction Book Club. Now, throughout 1953, Sidgwick continued with their lavishly illustrated non-fiction books about space travel, such as Man on the Moon and Across the Space Frontiers, both edited by Cornelius Ryan. In these books, they advertised their science fiction novels as well as the Science Fiction Book Club. You can see that if we look at the back flap. There we can see the advertising. And here are just a few of the beautiful full-colour illustrations which were featured in these largely produced books. I'm just turning to some of the plates. There's a beautiful double-page spread. And there's one more particularly nice one. There we are. That's something in this book. Beautiful lunar landscape there. And there's the bone still cover, which we saw earlier. Now, the man who had spearheaded Sidgwick and Jackson's admirable science fiction initiative was a man called Herbert Jones. A fascinating sidelight showing his commitment can be found in Alistair Patterson's editorial in the second, February 1954, issue of the Vorgostatten Science Fiction magazine. Let's have a look at his editorial. Let's see here. Another gratifying indication that science fiction is commanding a new and wider respect is that such an august body as the Publishers Advertising Circle should devote one of their lunchtime meetings to discussing the facts about science fiction. 3 viewpoints were presented, respectively, by Mr. Arthur C. Clarke as author, Mr. Herbert Jones of Sidgwick and Jackson as publisher, and Mr. Eric Williams of Books and Careers as bookseller. Mr. Arthur C. Clarke needs no introduction, holding as he does a high place in the respect of readers for his The Exploration of Space, and also his chairmanship of the British Interplanetary Society. In his talk, he annihilated quite a few fallacies, not the least of these being that science fiction was an American invention. He emphasised the point that it was only because of the rise of so many science fiction magazines in America that people were under this quite false impression. At the same meeting, Mr. Herbert Jones, whose firm Sidgwick and Jackson is doing such excellent work to further the cause of science fiction, spoke of the firm's aspirations in the field. In passing, we should note that Grayson and Grayson who we featured in an earlier video, were doing quite a bit of advertising in the science fiction magazines. And here we see one of their many advertisements. Incidentally, the cover there, the rather garish cover, but quite attractive, was by John Richards. April 1954 saw the first English edition of Clarke's masterpiece of the Alien Overlords, Childhood's End. Its accompanying title was the markedly inferior Hole in Heaven by F. Dubré Fawcett. Astute fans would have immediately been alerted that this book, Burke was a Freudian slip, that this book represented a new departure, because the attractive full-colour artwork that had hitherto characterised the series was replaced by an arty-farty design in just two colours. Sure enough, the inside flap announced, "This book is the first of a series of science fiction novels by British writers, edited by Angus Wilson." Wilson was an academic with a genuine predilection and liking for science fiction, who had commendably been doing considerable behind-the-scenes proselytising for science fiction in literary circles. The following year, he would persuade the august national newspaper, The Observer, to run a competition for the best new science fiction stories, from which entries he made a selection of 21 so-called prize-winning short stories that was published by Heinlein the following year. The less said of this book, the better. It was dealt with in my earlier video, number 33. In his editor's note to his first selection, Wilson argued that for all its many virtues, the chief fault of much science fiction that prevented it gaining serious literary recognition was that most of its writers neglected the human condition and afflicted readers with poor characterization and dialogue, which few people would argue with. Fawcett's novel, telling of a man whose body is possessed by an extra-dimensional alien, Nemo, was presented as happily meeting this more exacting good human interest criteria. Wilson was presumably unaware at the time that Fawcett was one of the most prolific hack writers of gangster sleaze, churning out novels under a slew of pseudonyms such as Ben Sardo for the Mushroom publishers. He or his publishers must have found out soon afterwards, though, which may account for the fact that no more Sidgwick science fiction novels by British writers with his recommendation ever appeared again. Instead, Sidgwick and Jackson's next science fiction release in May was Robert Heinlein's famous American collection, The Green Hills of Earth, happily reinstating a beautiful full-colour dust jacket by Gerald Quinn. It was followed in September by Heinlein's noted juvenile novel, Starman Jones. October saw a sparkling first collection of short stories by Arthur C. Clarke, Expedition to Earth, which Clarke generously dedicated to his friend and first editorial mentor, Walter Gillings, in whose magazine Tales of Wonder he'd made his first professional debut. Here we see his dedication to the pioneering editor, Walter Gillings. There we are. That's it. And there's the first ever collection of Arthur C. Clarke's best short stories. After this splurge of titles, there was a long hiatus, and 1955 saw only a single American title in October. Judith Merrill's hefty collection, Beyond the Barriers of Space and Time, with an introduction by another American luminary, Theodore Sturgeon. While it's mainly drawn from the top regular science fiction magazine specialists such as Asimov, Bradbury, Dick, and so on, there's also included stories from outside literary figures, and even a story by Agatha Christie. The stories were drawn not just from the pulp magazines, but from such magazines as Esquire, The New Yorker, and the Saturday Evening Post. However, a betraying sign that the publisher was about to withdraw, albeit temporarily, from the science fiction fray was the book's two-colour billboard dust jacket. The final American novel, The Dynamic Tiger, aka The Star's My Destination, by Alfred Bester, with a disappointing two-colour cover, didn't appear until June 1956, by which time the science fiction slump had set in good and hard. Today, this edition of Bester's famous debut novel is a prime collectible as a world first, because it preceded the American paperback original. Good luck trying to find an affordable copy. Sidgwick thereafter withdrew the science fiction line and reverted to the earlier success with sumptuously illustrated non-fiction books, such as Willie Lay's The Exploration of Mars, which we see here with more superb bone-still illustrations. Bone-still was the artist who Ron Turner acknowledged as being his inspiration. Here we see a couple of beautiful astronomical plates by Bone-still. And there's a splendid panorama on Mars as well. But before the 1956 bust, British hardcover science fiction had enjoyed a boom, and we'll be taking a look at some more examples in my next video.